Our second reading is taken from chapter 10 of the first book of Kings. And King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. 600 shekels of gold went into each shield. He also made 300 shields of hammered gold. 3 minas of gold went into each shield. The king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with pure gold. The throne had 6 steps, and the top of the throne was round at the back. There were armrests on either side of the place of the seat, and 2 lions stood beside the armrest. 12 lions stood there, one on each side of the 6 steps. Nothing like this had been made for any other kingdom. All King Solomon's drinking vessels were gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Not one was silver, for this was accounted as nothing in the days of Solomon. For the king had merchant ships at sea with a fleet of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the merchant ships came bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys. So King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. Now all the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. Each man brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, armor, spices, horses, and mules, at a set rate year by year. And Solomon gathered the chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king at Jerusalem. The king made the silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made the cedar trees as abundant as the sycamores which are in lowland. Amen. Our further reading is a portion taken from the work Divine Providence. Solomon was permitted to establish idolatrous worship. This was done that he might represent the Lord's kingdom or the church with all forms of religion in the whole world. For the church established with the nation of Israel and Judah was a representative church, and therefore all the judgments and statutes of the church represented the spiritual things of the church, which are its internals. The people themselves represented the church. The king represented the Lord, David representing the Lord who was to come into the world, and Solomon the Lord after his coming. Because the Lord after the glorification of his human had power over heaven and earth, as he himself says in Matthew. Therefore Solomon, who represented him, appeared in glory and magnificence, and possessed the wisdom of all the kings of the earth, and also built the temple. Moreover, he permitted and established the forms of worship of many nations, by which were represented the various religions in the world. His wives, who numbered 700, his concubines, who numbered 300, had a similar signification. For a wife in the word signifies the church, and the concubine a form of religion. Who is your favorite biblical figure? Young boys like mighty warriors such as Joshua and Gideon, and girls prefer Deborah, the female judge. All biblical characters represents the Lord as to his specific attributes. Have you seen the Lord's trace in these characters of the Word? We need to use our imagination to envision the Lord in these biblical characters' descriptive accounts from the Word. Yet, in its deepest sense, all incidents, stories, and anecdotes of the Word mainly refer to the Lord Himself. Many biblical characters, such as priests, judges, and kings, represent the Lord. King Solomon stands out among these glorious characters, representing the Lord in his glory and wisdom. Solomon was born as the 10th son, King David, and the second son of Bathsheba. Considering his birth order, Solomon was far from an obvious heir to the throne. Yet he became David's successor by divine intervention. According to 1 Chronicles 22, the Lord had revealed to David that Solomon would be the next to rule Israel. Solomon's childhood was different from that of his father. Whereas Saul and David had been born as common people and grew up in humble villages, Solomon was born in the palace in Jerusalem and grew up in a loyal family. His privileged childhood seems to refer to his distinctive representation. Kingship in the Word represents the Lord. David represented the Lord who would come into the world, and Solomon represented the Lord after his advent and glorification. The Lord's advent, despite the trials and passion on the cross, was fulfilled in the glory of his resurrection. After the glorification of his humanity, the Lord declared, "All power has been given to me in heaven and on earth." This most glorious and magnificent moment is reflected in Solomon's great glory and prosperity. The Lord's royalty was represented by the throne constructed by Solomon. He made a great throne of ivory overlain with the finest gold. It had 6 steps, and 12 lions stood there on both sides of the 6 steps. Here the throne of glory and lions represent divine truth, fighting and conquering evils. Solomon's name occurs about 300 times in the Old Testament and 12 times in the New Testament, and is often associated with wisdom and wealth. Solomon's glory began with his amazing God-given wisdom. One of Solomon's first acts as king was a sacrifice to the Lord at Gibeon. There the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream and asked him, "What shall I give you?" Solomon asked for understanding heart with which to judge Israel and the ability to tell good from evil. God granted Solomon's request and also promised him riches and honor if he would only walk in the steps of his father, David. Solomon's wisdom was shown in his versatile talents. His proverbs and songs of songs manifested his deep knowledge of morality and the natural world. He also examined nature, delving into plants and animals. He deeply understood human nature as shown by his judgment of the two women who claimed to be the mother of the same child. His wise solution that the child is physically divided between the two revealed the true mother. He also set up 12 provincial districts for the purpose of effective administration and taxation. The boundaries of these districts did not conform to traditional tribal boundaries. This appeared to have been Solomon's attempt to sublime tribal loyalties into national patriotism. Solomon loved knowledge and wisdom and seemed to maintain the same interest in the other world. Swedenborg wrote his personal experience saying, "When I spoke with him several times, he did not want to speak at all except by riddles, put in such a way that he would utter half of his saying, then wanted the other to say it, and the rest would follow by guessing. So it was a broken conversation. Besides this, there were also other kinds of riddles." Solomon's unprecedented wisdom represents the Lord's infinite wisdom and truth. Nevertheless, the Lord went through the same kind of development process as our own while he was on earth. And this intellectual growth is shown in Solomon's building projects, because in the word, houses denote human minds. The Lord's first education was instruction in the knowledge of the word, and this instruction was represented by his being brought down to Egypt. Continuing with the same representation, Solomon developed good diplomatic relations with Egypt and married a daughter of Pharaoh, even building a house for her in Jerusalem. In the human mind, there should be knowledge, intelligence, and wisdom for spiritual growth. These three are called natural, rational, and spiritual. Solomon actually built several houses. First, he built the Jerusalem temple as the house of God on the Mount of Moriah, representing the spiritual, and then the house of the forest of Lebanon, which represents the rational. The cedar and thus Lebanon signifies the rational. Then Solomon built a house for the daughter of Pharaoh, which means knowledge. This knowledge is from the literal sense of the word, which is natural. In this way, the Lord's spiritual, rational, and natural developments are reflected in Solomon's three major building projects. Solomon's wisdom was celebrated far and near. Even the Queen of Sheba heard of his reputation and came with vast amounts of wealth to test his wisdom, camels carrying spices, much gold, and precious stones. Solomon answered all her hard questions with ease. As a result, the Queen of Sheba, who was impressed by his wisdom and immense empire, gave him spices, gold, and precious stones. Her presenting gifts to Solomon reminds us of the three wise men presenting precious gifts to the baby Jesus. Actually, her gifts symbolically meant that wisdom and intelligence the Lord acquired, and the Queen of Sheba represented the celestial qualities of the church. Solomon became extremely rich from his extensive trade with a number of nations. Some of Israel's trade was conducted overland by way of camel caravans, but the most significant trade was by sea across the Mediterranean through an alliance with Tyre. Solomon's ships went as far as Ophir and Spain to bring back gold and silver. The combination of peaceful relations with other nations, extensive sea routes, and effective control of the major overland trading routes poured wealth into Solomon's empire at a spectacular rate. Gold, silver, and cedar were no longer rarities in Jerusalem. Solomon particularly loved trading horses. He procured horses and chariots from Egypt and sold them to other nations. This is quite symbolic because horses and chariots represent understanding and doctrines. It is written in 1 Kings chapter 10, "The king made the silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made the cedar trees as abundant as the sycamores which are in the lowland." Solomon's enormous wealth represents the Lord's appropriation of infinite knowledge, intelligence, and wisdom. Solomon's spiritual integrity decreased as he grew older. Solomon ended up having a total of 700 wives and 300 concubines, many of whom were acquired through political alliance. He allowed many of these women to worship their pagan gods. In fact, he built pagan temples for them. The result was that Jerusalem and even its holy temple became the scene of pagan practices and idol worship. Solomon's own faith was weakened. Eventually, he approved and even participated in these terrible idolatrous acts. Solomon's polygamy was an apparent sin. However, we need to be reminded that Solomon represented the Lord, and his actions were involved in divine operations. Moreover, the Jews were permitted to do so because they were the kind of men and women with whom conjugal love didn't exist. With such people, that permission was possible without any harm being done to the conjugal covenant. Thus, the Jewish biblical figures, we remember Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, were permitted to do so for the sake of the representation. Solomon's wives and concubines represent many celestial and spiritual churches that are conjoined with the Lord. Solomon's idolatry was a serious violation of the commandment. However, when this representation is understood as a divine action, it turns out quite the opposite meaning. We read in Divine Providence, Solomon permitted and instituted as well the forms of worship of many nations, which represented the various religious practices in the world. The like was symbolized by his wives, of which he had been 100, and by his concubines, of which he had 300. The Lord accommodates his religion to humankind and accommodates his church to the nature, culture, and disposition of specific people. Religion and belief have played an important part in human history because religion should exist with all people on earth in order to teach them about the Lord, life after death, and the good life. However, people's states and natures are too diverse to be accommodated with one single religion that would neither meet nor satisfy their unique needs. The Lord transforms His church into different beliefs by accommodating His teachings, rituals, and forms of revelations so that all people might have some religion to some extent from His love. For the first time under Solomon's rule, Israel experienced a stable peace and prosperity. Because Solomon was the most glorious king, his downfall in his later life makes us disappointed. Though Solomon represented the Lord, his representational role couldn't save him. A biblical character's personal life is not identical to one's representational role. The Lord uses his personal saga to convey spiritual meanings. Solomon's dramatic degeneration manifests his real characteristics. Swedenborg wrote his own experience about him in The Other World Again. Solomon was portrayed as he is today among those living after death, namely that he does not know anything spiritual, much less heavenly, but is so stupid that he does not know in the least what this house symbolizes, except that it had been so built to display splendor. Therefore, he is now among the stupid, who before had been counted among the wise. His wisdom was also pictured as earthly, that is, a wisdom in earthly matters, and in civil ones relating to the life of society, but not in heavenly matters. Although Solomon's wisdom surpassed that of all others, his wisdom wasn't true because it was confined to the natural and scientific realms. Solomon didn't care about spiritual matters. This shows what true wisdom is. We may not be able to compose brilliant musical scores or poems. We may not know much about plants and animals. However, we can still be wise by knowing what is right and wrong and choosing what is right. Our knowing is cultivated from the Word and our willingness to abide by it. These spiritual efforts makes us intelligent and wise by the divine light. In contrast to the reality of his life, Solomon represented the Lord. The Lord's glory is reflected in his glory. The Lord's infinite attributes are shown in his immense wealth. The Lord's wisdom is portrayed in his exceptional wisdom. Solomon was allowed to build the temple, which represents the Lord's divine human. He represented the Lord on earth. The Lord's infinite mercy and love are beautifully manifested in such terrible polygamy and idolatry of Solomon. The Lord reaches out to our nature, disposition, and present understanding by accommodating himself so that he may affect us. His religion may be applied to our lives, and we may be conjoined with him. The Lord appears in the literal sense of the word to give us a tangible image of Himself. Then how obvious in His presence in the new church. He is ostensibly shown in every incident and each story in His word. His mercy and love are manifested in even detestable sins and cruel punishments in their symbolic and representational meanings. He is everywhere. How can we ignore Him? How can we possibly forget the Lord in our life? And how can we doubt His love for us? We read, "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me." Amen. And now to the one only God, Jesus Christ, be glorified.